This is Nordic Climate Talks, a podcast by Nordic Development Fund. Welcome to Nordic Climate Talks, where we explore bold ideas, collaborative action, and the Nordic voice in global climate leadership. The world's eyes are turning to Brazil and to the heart of the Amazon in Belém as we approach the next UN climate conference, COP30. This year's summit brings together global leaders, negotiators, and change makers to assess progress and push forward on climate goals. Today, I'm honored to welcome a very special guest, Mattias Frumerie, Climate Ambassador and Head of Delegation to the UNFCCC at the Swedish Ministry of Climate and Enterprise. Mattias, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much.
Mattias, as Sweden's climate ambassador and lead negotiator, you've had a front row seat to the evolution of the UN climate conferences. Could you share what the main themes are for COP30 and how you see Nordic actors contributing to the global climate conversation?
Well, from a Swedish and a Nordic, I would think, and an EU perspective, the key task for us at COP30 is to ensure a negotiated outcome when it comes to the new nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. And the NDCs are the vehicle that we have designed in the Paris Agreement for all countries to present what they are prepared to contribute with when it comes to jointly limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So as you know, in the Paris Agreement, there's not sort of a top-down approach saying which countries should be doing what, but rather we have chosen the bottom-up approach where all countries come and say what they're prepared to do in order to limit temperature rise to 1.5. And this we do every 5 years. So this is the third time. The first time was in Paris in 2015, then the second time ahead of COP26, and now the third time that we're delivering the new NDCs. So it's not the NDCs themselves that we negotiate, but rather the sort of a response from the global community, which reflects on the gap which we are currently seeing in terms of what countries are prepared to do and what we as a global community need to do in order to limit temperature rise. So that is the key outcome for us at COP30.
Thank you. And what are the main themes?
Well, I mean, the main theme for us is the NDCs. And then, of course, I mean, each COP has some, let's say, almost 100 different agenda items, various types of reports which are presented from committees and from work programs. I sometimes make a comparison with, an association where you have an annual meeting, or a company maybe even where you have your annual general meeting where, there is an election of the board. You decide on the budget, you hear from various committees on the kind of the work that they've been doing during the course of the year. In a way, it's a similar setup we have here, where all parties to the Paris Agreement come together. We look at progress done during the past year, and we'll also set the direction for next year. And so in many cases, that's what the COPs are all about, sort of to looking back and looking forward and sort of taking stock of where we are. And then at some COPs, we also have sort of these bigger ticket issues where there are specific agenda items which would take a lot of negotiation time. And for example, last year, when we met in Baku at COP29, the main theme was a new collective quantified goal, as we call it, the new climate finance goal, which we decided there. And the year before that, in Dubai at COP28, it was the conclusion of the global stocktake, or the GST. And this year, for us, it is indeed the new nationally determined contributions, which is the main theme for the meeting.
Thank you. And speaking of the Paris Agreement, this year marks a decade since the signing of it. Yet despite global efforts, 2024, as we all know, was the first year when we surpassed the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. So what does the international community need to do differently to manage the challenges of a warming planet? And more so, why is maintaining high ambition more critical than ever?
Well, as you say, it's more critical than ever. I mean, as we're approaching 2030, when the UN Climate Panel and the IPCC has said repeatedly that we need to limit or reduce emissions by 43% compared to 2019 levels by 2030 in order for us to limit temperature rise to 1.5. And of course, the closer we get to 2030, the more urgent is that need for action. And these new NDCs, which will now be presented ahead of COP30, they have a timeline up until 2035. So that also sort of presents us with what we need to do until or before 2035. And from our perspective, we've seen progress with the Paris Agreement. When we entered into the Paris Agreement 10 years ago, we were headed towards some 4 degrees of global warming. At this stage, we've reduced that gap. So now we're sort of moving towards 2.5 degrees of warming, which of course is still too high, but it's much better than we're in a much better place today than we were 10 years ago. So that is progress, and we need to recognize that. But as you've stated, we need to accelerate our efforts. And so from a Swedish perspective, we're increasingly focusing on the solutions that we know are available and which we see that all countries can deploy in order to accelerate their transition to net zero. And hopefully by all countries deploying these kind of solutions, we will also jointly accelerate the transition and be able to limit temperature rise to 1.5.
Thank you. Speaking of Sweden and the Nordics as a whole, we've had a long tradition of collaboration on climate action. So can you tell more, how do Nordic actors work together to advance global climate goals, and why is this specific collaboration so vital?
I think what I hope also that we from the Nordic region can set a good example in terms of sharing our approach to the transition, where, many of us have been working for quite some time on how to build our sustainable economies and moving away from a fossil-based economy to a fossil-free economy. And having done so, sort of growing our economies whilst also reducing our emissions during quite a long time. So proving that it's possible to still achieve growth, but at the same time then reduce your emissions. I think that's one example which all of the Nordic countries are happy to share with global partners. Of course, all countries need to find their own model for doing this, but I think sort of the general approach is something which we as Nordic countries are happy to share with the global partners in terms of how that transition to net zero can be met whilst at the same time strengthening competitiveness and securing new jobs and growth for our economies.
Thanks, Mattias. You've been in this for a while, so if we can just take a step back, look back over the past decade and speak about the different conversations around climate. How has that evolved in your view, and what has been the most significant shift or development? You've kind of touched on it a bit, but if you can expand more.
Well, I think one significant development which we've seen only in the past year is the increase of the number of actors who are highlighting the opportunities in the transition and what it brings in terms of new jobs and growth and strength and competitiveness. We see very clearly the incoming Brazilian COP30 presidency highlighting how they see the link between climate action and a strong economy and jobs and growth. We heard a speech from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres this summer about the opportunities in the energy transition. And we're seeing companies globally, not least in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, highlighting the kind of solutions that they can provide in order to accelerate the transition to net zero, but also underlining what they need in order to deploy these kind of solutions. And ultimately, that is policy changes and policies that create demand for these kind of solutions that they in turn can then deploy. But I think all of those are positive developments over the past year, which really shows the momentum in the transition to net zero.
Speaking of COP29 to COP30, there is this Baku to Belém roadmap, which aims to scale up climate finance to $1.3 trillion annually for developing countries by 2035. So we would like to hear, what are your thoughts on this roadmap? And in particular, how do you see Nordic Development Fund as a joint Nordic climate and development financier contributing to this very ambitious goal?
Well, firstly, I think it was a very welcome development that we could actually agree the new finance target at COP29. And I think also a good decision to set out this roadmap process, which has been ongoing for the past year. And we're looking forward to the report to be published from the roadmap, which hopefully will include a number of recommendations on what all countries can do in order to ensure the deployment and mobilization of the finance which decided, namely reaching the $1.3 trillion annually by 2035. I'd really like to underline that it's something which we see that all countries have a role, and that all countries can take efforts to ensure that they attract the kind of investment necessary for us all to be able to jointly meet that target of $1.3 trillion. And I think all financial actors, including, of course, the Nordic Development Fund, can be part of this and see, what are the respective roles that we can play according to the various types of responsibilities and mandates that we have. But I think from a development finance perspective, making sure that we can help to build capital markets, that we can find these kind of cutting edge projects which will help accelerate the transition and show again, that the solutions are out there and that we can jointly accelerate efforts to reach net zero.
And finally, what outcomes would you consider a success for this year's climate conference?
I think the key element for us from a Swedish and EU perspective, and I would think Nordic as well, is to get an outcome where we respond to the gap between what countries need to do and what we have to do and what we are prepared to do. So responding to the NDC synthesis report, where we have then sort of a presentation of what countries are prepared to do, but also we need to look at what we have to do in order to limit temperature rise to 1.5. So setting out that kind of process within the UNFCCC, I think is sort of the measure of success for us for COP30. But obviously, there are a number of other topics as well, which are up for negotiation. We have a decision expected on what we call indicators for global adaptation. We also are set to decide on a new gender action plan for the UNFCCC, a number of finance-related items, and also we have a new set of reports which came out last year called biannual transparency reports, the new reporting system according to the Paris Agreement, where we also have a synthesis report where the UNFCCC Secretariat have sort of synthesized what the conclusions from the many BTRs which have been delivered. So while the NDCs are forward-looking in terms of what countries are prepared to do, the BTRs are more backward-looking in taking stock of what countries actually have done. So I think that's also a useful report to look into and how we can be helping each other to accelerate implementation more generally.
That we shall do. Thank you so much, Mattias, for sharing your insights and for the work you continue to do on behalf of Sweden and the global climate community. COP30 is a pivotal moment, and the Nordics do have a powerful role to play. To our listeners, stay engaged, stay curious, and keep pushing for climate action that's bold, inclusive, and sustainable. Until next time, this is Nordic Climate Talks. See you at COP30. This is Nordic Climate Talks, a podcast by Nordic Development Fund.